standing up here, I just want to, Chrissy was reminding me down here that I probably need to share with you guys that we voted last week to call Matt as the associate pastor, and so that is done, and we're glad you're around here for longer, and so we're thankful for that. So if you didn't get word on that, I just wanted to share that with you guys this morning. Good to see some students back this morning too. I guess school is getting ready to start, and good to see you guys back with us. Some of you students have not been here this summer, and see several of you who maybe this is your first time here. And just want to say, we are in the middle of a series in the book of Genesis. So you might feel a little lost if you just kind of jump in today and you're like, what are they talking about? And those of you who've been here every week, you kind of been following the story along every week. So we are in the book of Genesis, and we are in the story of Jacob at this point in time. And as you see on the screen here, we're going to talk about a particular instance in Jacob's life today where he encounters God in a pretty dramatic way. In 1999, Stephen King released a novel called The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon. And in this book, we read the story of 9-year-old Tricia McFarland. I'm going to see if that works. There we go. This is a story where she is with her family on a hike through the Appalachian Mountains, and she stops to go to the restroom and loses her family and loses her way and is lost and alone. She sits down and she closes her eyes, and she tried to pray to God. But she wasn't sure if God was there. She wasn't sure how to address God. And she remembered at one point in her life, she asked her father about God. You know, is there a God? Is he real? And her father said, well, God's kind of like the air conditioner, or I think in the book he's talking about the water running through the pipes, and it's kind of, he's always there, but not really personal. And I think he called him a subaudible God. But Tricia wasn't sure about that sort of God, and it wasn't the kind of God she really wanted to pray to. And she remembered her favorite baseball player, whose name was Tom Flash Gordon. And whenever he would have a great event, play for the Boston Red Sox, Roger, and he would point to the sky and he would say, he would give credit to God. And Tom Gordon's God was the God who is revealed through Jesus Christ. Very personal sort of God. So, after 9 days of being bug-bitten and scared and cut and sick from drinking bad water and eating poisonous berries, Tricia finally pleaded with the God of Tom Gordon, please help me get out of these woods. She needed a God who was really there, not her father's subaudible sort of God. The story ends with Tricia rescued, and she is in the hospital, and her father is the last to leave. And she looks at her father and she points to the sky, to the God of Tom Gordon. In this morning's text, we find a God who's very up close and personal, particularly as it relates to the story of Jacob. So this morning, if you're kind of just picking up in the middle here, and you're thinking, well, I don't really remember who Jacob was or how all of this works out. Let me give you just a little bit of background. You might remember Jacob is the grandson of Abraham, the son of Isaac. He has a twin brother named Esau. And Jacob did some pretty despicable things. You remember he stole his brother's birthright, or at least sold him a birthright for kind of an unfair deal. And then he outright stole, tricked his father into giving him his blessing. And you might remember the story. Jacob, then Esau's ready to kill him, his twin brother, and then Jacob travels in order to get away from Esau back to their homeland, to his uncle Laban's house. And last week we talked about he then is tricked. He is deceived. He works for 7 years for this girl named Rachel who he loves. And on the wedding night, a little switcheroo going on there. And he wakes up and there is Leah. and then he works another 7 years for Leah. The story... in the story, there's some 20 years that Jacob is in this Paddan Aram. He's there with Leah and Rachel. They've had children. And things kind of develop. And Laban, who is his father-in-law, works out this deal with him. And if you read chapter 31, you can read all about this. I won't go into all the details, but the Bible is very detailed in terms of how it says that Jacob had the deal worked out. But Jacob was somehow kind of working the system, and he was getting rich on Uncle Laban's dime. Or father-in-law and uncle, I guess both. And so the story, as the story unwinds, Laban's sons are not too pleased with Jacob, and they're telling Laban, you know, he's taking all your money, he's getting rich on your dime, and so there's some tension in the family there. And at the same time that all this tension is going on, God appears to Jacob, and God tells him, we read here in chapter 31, verse 3, then the Lord said to Jacob, go back to the land of your fathers and to your relatives, and I will be with you. This is a key phrase, this I will be with you. So, in other words, Jacob is told by God to go back to his homeland. It's been some 20 years. Now, there's a problem here. Esau, as far as Jacob knows, is still in the homeland, or still back in Abraham's land, the land of his father Isaac, or Abraham and Isaac. And it's been 20 years, and as far as we know, there's not any contact between Esau and Jacob. So as far as Jacob knows, Esau's waiting, ready to kill him. But remember, God said go. There's some family tension here that probably contributed to the deal. And God said, I will be with you as you go. So Jacob packs his family up, his 2 wives, maidservants, all the children, and he leaves. Now, we do want to note that at the end of very end of chapter 31, Jacob does leave on good terms with Laban, so he didn't sneak out overnight or anything like that. We read in verse 55 of chapter 31, early the next morning, Laban kissed his grandchildren and his daughters and blessed them. Then he left and returned home. Now, not long after he leaves, he meets up with this group of angels along the way, these messengers. And he says, you know, good to see you guys here. And by the way, would you do me a favor? Would you go ahead of me and scope out what's going on with Esau? Because I'm a little worried what's going to happen. So sure enough, the angels go and they scope it out. And they come back, and the news that they have when they get back is not too good for Jacob. Look at we're in chapter 32, Genesis 32. And by the way, let me invite you to open your Bibles up and have the text open. I think you'll want to be studying this along as we go. But in Genesis chapter 32, verse 6, we read, when the messengers returned to Jacob, they said, we went to your brother Esau, and now he's coming to meet you. And 400 men are with him. Uh-oh, right? Doesn't say he's going to kill you, but doesn't look too good. Now, 400 men, what does that mean? Well, we know we read earlier in Genesis where Abraham goes with 300 men and takes out 4 kings. So we know that 400 men can certainly take care of Jacob and his 2 wives and their family, right? So Esau's coming, and this is the tension that we find Jacob in at this point in his life. Again, God's told him, go. I will be with you. But at the same time, it seems that danger is coming his way. So, what does Jacob do? He divides his family into 2 camps. He figures at least a portion of his family will survive, right? So he takes Leah and her children and maidservants, and he puts them over here. And he takes Rachel and her children and maidservants and puts them over here. And he figures, well, at least if Esau comes after one group, the other group can hightail it and get out of there, right? And maybe at least part of my family will survive. At the same time, he sends a gift to Esau. This elaborate gift of animals. You can read all about it there in chapter 32. Again, Jacob had become wealthy. lots of livestock and animals, and so he sends some of this ahead as a gift to Esau. And this was very common in the ancient Middle East. You would do this with a king that you thought was going to take you out. You would send what you might call a tribute, right, to that king. And the king would receive that gift, and many times would go, okay, they're cool, we're not going to mess with them because they gave us all these animals, right? And so that's how it worked out. So that's what Jacob is doing here. So we got Jacob sending the gift and waiting to see what's going to happen. Now, next week we're going to talk about this encounter with Esau. Jacob's going to meet Esau face to face next week. But this week we're going to talk about this strange occurrence that happens on the night prior to that. Tim's going to come now and read this text for us. We're going to be focusing on verse 22 through 32. So this is Genesis 32, 22 through 32, okay? That's what we're going to read here. Tim's going to read that for us.
That night Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 maidservants, and his 11 sons and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The man asked him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with men and have overcome." Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." The sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the tendon attached to the socket of the hip, because the socket of Jacob's hip was touched near the tendon.
All right. Thanks, Tim. I appreciate that. Now, you can imagine Jacob would have been afraid, don't you think? He was unsure what was going to happen. It's very likely that he was going to be killed. So here he is with his family, his 2 wives and their children. And so they cross over the river. Now, again, the river is the entrance to the land. And so they're kind of making their way into the land. Now, if you knew that your brother, who you tricked, is coming after you with 400 men, you'd probably want to take off the other direction, don't you think? So it's an act of faith that Jacob crosses the river. Just the same as his grandfather Abraham was called to go into the land. He followed God into the land. Jacob in the same way is exhibiting faith. Faith in God. I'm going to go where you told me to go. You said you would be with me. I'm going to go. So he steps over into the land. And so he sends his family and all the possessions across the river. The text tells us in verse 23 there, after he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. So Jacob was left alone. Now, he's by himself now. He's not with his family at this point. And you got to think, if you're going to face what Jacob is going to face the next day, you might have a little trouble sleeping, don't you think? You might be a little anxious. But he had no idea what was going to happen next. Very quickly in the text, we read, so Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. Now, this is kind of odd, isn't it? I mean, what is going on here? Is Jacob having a nightmare? What does it mean that this man is wrestling with him until daybreak? Keep reading in verse 25. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. So, we're reading along here. We got this man wrestling with Jacob, and the man is unable to overpower Jacob. Now, we know Jacob's a stud, right? I mean, what did he do last week? You remember that? He had like the big I'm thinking cement, but it was probably a rock sort of thing over a well. And you had to wait until all the shepherds got there to lift it off. And Jacob sees Rachel coming. He wants to impress her. What does he do? He does the whole thing by himself, right? So Jacob's pretty buff, right? At least we want to think so. And this person is wrestling with Jacob, and he cannot overpower him. And it says here, the man touches the socket of Jacob's hip, and his hip is wrenched. Now, what does that mean? I think the ESV translation is a better translation here. It says that his hip was put out of joint. Ouch, right? That would be very painful. It would hurt. So they're wrestling all night, and then Jacob's hip is touched. And then we read in verse 26, then the man said, let me go, for it is daybreak. But Jacob replied, I will not let you go until you bless me. Now, what is all of this about? Now, if you've heard this story in Sunday school growing up, it's probably familiar to you. But if you've never heard it before, this ought to be a little strange to you as you read this text. And Jacob's hip is out of joint. I mean, can you imagine how bad that would be hurting? And somebody's wrestling with you, and they knock your hip out of joint. Don't you think you're going to go, get out of here then, right? But Jacob is holding on to him. Jacob's not willing to let go. Do you see the different dynamics in this wrestling match here? Now wrestling's a pretty intense sport. Have you guys ever watched wrestling match? Dawson wrestles in middle school, and if you go and you watch that, I know the first few times we watched that, it was like, whoa, man, this is intense stuff, isn't it? I mean, you got to wear the little Speedo thing, which is kind of awkward to begin with, right? But then you're up close and personal, aren't you? And it gets intense. And people's faces are turning red, right? And they're going at it. And you know, even though it's just, less than a minute they're wrestling, it feels like an eternity, right? And Jacob's wrestling all night long. And his hip is knocked out of joint. And he's still going at it, right? And the different dynamics you see here, you see, and just in case you don't know yet, we find out this man is God. God is the one wrestling with Jacob. And God has come to him, and God is not letting go of him. Now, God doesn't let him overpower him, which is interesting, right? God knocks his hip out of joint. Just make sure Jacob's not too prideful here that, he beat God in a wrestling match. You don't want to say that he could do that, right? And so he knocks his hip out of joint. But at the same time, God has come to him. God is wrestling with him. Jacob is refusing to let go of him. And that is part of the story, too. Now, we understand why Jacob is calling out to God for a blessing, right? What's going to happen the next day? He's going to meet Esau. He's probably a little nervous. He's not sure how this thing is going to turn out. So he wants a blessing from God, and he's calling out to him. Now, let's see what the result here is. There's two things that happen to Jacob as we think about this. The first thing that happens as a result of this all-night skirmish is Jacob's name is changed. Okay, now we're going to come back in a minute and talk about what this means for us, but let's just stay in the text here for a minute and see what happens here as this happens. Number one, Jacob's name is changed. Now, it's interesting in the ancient Middle East and the mindset of the ancient Middle East, many times if someone changes someone else's name, we understand that the one who is doing the name change has power or authority over the one whose name is being changed. Okay, so if a king would capture someone or a foreign king, they would sometimes change the name of that foreign king as a result of having authority over that king. And so we remember God changed Abraham's name, right? Sarah's name. And now he's coming and changing Jacob's name. So on the one hand, it is God saying he has authority over Jacob. On the other hand, it's a result of something new happening in Jacob's life. You remember Abraham and Sarah? They came from this land. God said, I want you to go to this land. And when you go to this land, I'm going to do something totally different than what would have happened if you would have stayed over there. But you followed me, you have faith, and God changes their name, and he does something with them. And here, Jacob has been going this way, right? Been doing his own thing. We talked last week about the fact that how does God put up with this guy for so long, right? I mean, he's a liar. He's a cheater. He's a deceiver. But God is going to do something different in him. And this is a pivot point in his life. And number two, not only does he change his name, but we also read, I want to show you this quote too. I had this in my notes. The IVP commentary says this of Jacob, that when God changes Jacob's name as a result of this wrestling match, a shift happens in his life. A shift from an outcast and usurper to the heir of the covenant and the chosen leader of God's people. What's his name? His name was Jacob. What's his name now? It's Israel. Israel. See, God's creating a people for himself, isn't he? God's doing something, and God changes Jacob's name. So not only does he change his name, but we also see that he touches the socket of his hip. And we see as a result of that, there we go, as a result of that, Jacob now has a limp, a physical reminder. As you would see Jacob walking around in his old age, he's limping because he encountered God, a physical reminder that God had power over Jacob, that God changed Jacob. It's a reminder of that night, of that wrestling match. So we've got a limp and we've got a name change. Look there in verse 29. Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" And he blessed him there. And isn't it interesting? God doesn't give Jacob what he wants. Jacob wants to know what his name is. God says, "I'll just bless you. I'm not going to tell you my name." And then we read in verse 31, so Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "It's because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." Think about this for a minute. In the ancient mindset, particularly in the Old Testament, if you see God, what happens to you? You die. You can't just see God. If you see God, you're dead, right? And Jacob's wrestling with God. I mean, this is crazy, right? In the Old Testament mindset, that God would come as a man and wrestle? I mean, it's kind of mind-boggling, isn't it? But this is what happens to Jacob. Now let's think about this for a minute. And we read this story, and again, if you read it for the first time and you come to this, you're probably going, what is this all about? God wrestling with Jacob. Some may conclude, as you read this, you might say, well, you know, Jacob was a little anxious because he's about to meet his brother, and he probably had a nightmare, you know, and he remembered, all this stuff was going on in his head, and maybe he rolled over the wrong way and his hip came out of joint, and you know, maybe Jacob was just kind of imagining this whole thing. That might be one interpretation of the text. But I think if you met Jacob, he would tell you a different story. It wasn't a nightmare. I was wrestling with God all night. And he wouldn't let me go, and I wouldn't let him go, and finally he knocked my hip out of joint, and then he was ready to go, and then I was still holding on. I wanted him to bless me. You see, Jacob would say, what happened that night was real. It was a theophany. It was God in flesh there with me, wrestling with me. And it changed me. And I'm no longer the man that I used to be. You see, Jacob would probably tell you that his whole life was one of wrestling. And do you remember when Jacob was born? What was he doing? He was holding on to the heel of his brother, right? Isn't that interesting? Even before that, what's happening inside of his mother's womb? The babies are jostling with each other. Jacob is one wrestling dude, isn't he? He likes to wrestle. And he's holding on the heel of his brother. And Esau gets out first. So Esau has all the rights, right? The birthright, the blessing, everything. But Jacob wrestles him out of it, right? He cooks a bowl of stew. Esau comes in from the field and he says to Esau, "Hey, I'll trade you the bowl of stew for your birthright." And Esau gives it up. Jacob wrestled him out of the birthright. And then you remember the story. Esau is off preparing dinner for his dad so his dad could bless him. And Jacob dresses up. Certainly it was his mom's idea, we know. But he dresses up as his brother, puts on his brother's clothes, goat hair on his hands and neck, because his brother's one hairy guy. And he goes in and he tricks his dad out of the blessing that was due to Esau. He's wrestling, isn't he? And then he goes over to Paddan Aram, and he gets tricked himself, gets the wrong wife, but he gets the right wife too. And then he wrestles Laban out of his wealth, and Jacob gets wealthy. Jacob is one deceitful, cheating dude, right? He just is. And God comes to him and wrestles him. God joins him where he is, on his level. And I think that night, this wrestling match is more than let's just see who can pin each other down. God is wrestling out of Jacob this old self, this selfish, in it for myself kind of person. God's wrestling it out of him over and over again. And so much so, he touches Jacob's hip. Pain's involved in the deal here, right? But God is doing in Jacob what needs to be done. And Jacob's response is appropriate. He's holding on to God the whole time. Now, if you're holding on to God and he just knocked your hip out of joint, that you almost want to let go, wouldn't you? But he's holding on anyways. Now let's think about this for you and me. Many of us wrestle with God in different ways, right? Maybe we don't have an all-night wrestling match, but we wrestle with God nonetheless, don't we? And we're fighting for our own way many times. We're fighting for what we want. We're going down this road, and God's wrestling us back into this way. God's doing in us what he needs to do. Sometimes it involves pain along the way. God's touching our hips. Sometimes we think we have it all figured out, and God touches our hips and he puts us back in our place, right? But we're wrestling with him. And let me say tonight, or this morning, if you're wrestling with God, the appropriate response is simply the response of Jacob. Don't let go. Hang on. He's not done with you yet. He's still working in you. He's still doing what he needs to do in you. Just hang on to him, okay? And he's going to do things that sometimes hurt. He's going to get you in a hold like this, and you're going to be going, ah, right? But God is going to come out on top, and you're going to come out blessed. Just hang on to God. Hang on. You know, we have different ways of thinking about God, don't we? Sometimes we think of God as our buddy, you know, our friend. He's going to just be there right there with us all the time, and he'll do whatever we want him to do. And when we need him for a test, we'll pray, and he'll help us out. And when we need him for this right relationship, he'll help us out, right? So we pray to him, and that's kind of our relationship with God, you know. So he's our friend. He's our buddy. Some of us view God as kind of distant or aloof. You know, he's out there, you know, not too close. He doesn't get too involved. But here in Scripture, we read of a wrestling God, a very personal, very intimate God. He's not necessarily our buddy. He's out many times holding us down in places we don't want to be, right? But he's doing it for our good. And in the end, he blesses us. In the end, we should be dead because we saw God. But instead, we're blessed. And Jacob leaves that night, or that morning, a different man. Got a different name and a different walk. I think, you know, and there's some debate about this. You know, Jacob had prayed to God before, and we saw on his way to Paddan Aram, he worshiped God and he tithed to God. So we know that there's some relationship with God here. But perhaps this is Jacob's conversion experience here on that night. Perhaps not until this point does he really get God and understand who God is, and does he really encounter God. But there's no doubt on this night when he walks away, he's a different man. He's a changed man. He's now living in the promise. He was living as the deceiver. Now he's living in the promise. Now his name is no longer Jacob. It is now Israel. I don't know what God's saying to you this morning. I don't know how this hits you. I'm not sure how this story finds you. Maybe this morning you're where Jacob was. Maybe you're a deceiver. Maybe you're a liar. Maybe your life is all about yourself and you're just doing whatever you can do to get by and trick people into making them think that their life is about you too? I don't know. Maybe this morning you'd be reminded that God is the kind of God who wants to wrestle you out of that into the person that He wants you to be. Maybe this morning you're wrestling with God. I mean, it's tough, and you're in this place where you're not sure how it's going to come out. Hang on to Him. Maybe this morning you've never encountered God. Maybe you just showed up this morning, or you're hearing this online, and you don't really know what kind of God you believe in. I pray that this story would speak to you and would remind you that we serve a personal God who's ready to wrestle with you. So get in the ring if that's where you are. I'm not sure where you are this morning, but we want to give you a few minutes to respond in whatever way that you would want to respond. As the band comes, we invite you to stand. This morning the altar is going to be open. If you need to come and pray, you do that now. I'll be standing down front if there's a decision that you'd like to make. If perhaps you've been attending for some time now and you'd like to come and join this body of believers, this would be the time that you would now come. Let's stand together.